I'm Frederick Gerten, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
Welcome to Pushback Talks, and we're back again. Leilani, the other day there was some great news coming out from the United States, and it's about language. President Biden said that housing is a right. That's what you've been stating for a long time. How did you feel when you read that?
One does not take lightly when the President of the United States says that housing is a human right. This is a huge step for that country, but also for the world.
Why is language so important for you?
I think language gives permission. It's like opening a door that allows for people to feel like, hey, right, I do have this right. The president said so. It also encourages other governments to go down that path, in my opinion. It creates a culture.
But language is great, but legislation is better. And there is actually a country here on the other side of the bridge called Denmark. I mean, I'm in Sweden, Denmark. I can actually see it. Long time since I've been there because of the lockdown, but they have something called Lex Blackstone, and we're going to talk about that today. We're going to wind back to 2 years ago when we had the amazing premiere of Push in Copenhagen at the fantastic festival CPH Docs, and we were playing for sold-out theaters. And you and I, together with the amazing festival and the press agent Line Bielenberg, they really managed to create what we call the perfect storm, because suddenly your language was in all the newspapers of Denmark. And in the second screening, there was a panel with a lot of Danish politicians. Do you remember there was on the street an anti-Blackstone demonstration in the street?
I do remember.
It was very heated. We actually have now on our podcast somebody who was then a young social democratic politician, but now he's the housing minister of Denmark, also the interior minister, Kaare Dybvad. So welcome to Pushback Talk, Kaare.
Thank you very much.
Do you remember that screening at CPH Docs of my film?
Yes, I remember it very clearly, and also the discussions we had afterwards, in the atmosphere in the streets, and also at the time it was a heated debate in Denmark about housing regulation, and it was just, I think, half a year before our general election, so that was very intense period also for me.
It was, and I remember that your predecessor, then a much more neoliberal, you're a social democrat, your predecessor as a housing minister, he said something like, there might be a problem in New York or maybe in London, but not in Copenhagen, he said. And then like 50% of the room was just standing up and shouting. It was kind of a very strong reaction, remember?
Yeah, I remember quite clearly, and what I think much of what people reacted on was that we actually had some very difficult cases where Blackstone was entering Copenhagen, buying up large properties where you had very low rent apartments, and I think some of the people there were also the people who were living in those apartments around the city center.
Yeah. There was, coming to almost every screening we had in Copenhagen, there were a lot of tenants coming from houses bought by Blackstone. And the stories coming from them was quite intense. This kind of stories that people knock their door and say, we want to change windows. Yeah, but the other landlord changed windows 8 months ago. No, we're going to change your windows. So there was all this kind of very aggressive way of trying to do renovations so they could push up the rent. When did you see this problem the first time? When did you understand how aggressive this was?
Well, in our legislation, we had a paragraph from the 90s where Copenhagen was a worn down industrial city. I think maybe as a Swede, you might remember that time. Copenhagen was almost bankrupt as a city and we changed the legislation back then so that you could make a large renovation of apartments and then push up the rent, and that was meant to be maybe a 50% increase when people moved out. But then through the decades since the 90s, it has been used more and more aggressively, and then when we saw some of the international investors, Blackstone as the most aggressive, but also others from the UK and from the US, then it came to a whole new level. And I got letters mails from people who had their rent pushed up by 200% and other crazy stories about also construction workers entering people's bedrooms at 6:30 in the morning, and all these stories, and of course it was part of a way to buy up apartments, and then because you have to get people to move to make these very profitable renovations, then they used all the methods they had to get people out of the apartments so they could push up the rent after renovating, and then get new tenants in, and usually the tenants who came in were people who were unaware of Danish housing regulation. For example, they had many from embassies around the world, and then just paid the price whatever high it was.
I have to admit that when I understood that Push the film would be screening as its world premiere in Denmark, I actually didn't know that Blackstone and other big asset management firms, etc., were active there. But of course, when I realized that Push was going there, then we started to do some research. And of course, I figured out that there were these protests going on, and this pattern that I had seen in so many other countries was, in fact, I couldn't believe it actually, that it was in fact playing out in Denmark and in Copenhagen specifically. I mean, I think you'll recall as UN rapporteur, I wrote a series of letters, including a letter to the government of Denmark. You were not minister at the time, and expressing my concern because I was seeing this global pattern. But it did surprise me that it had taken hold in Copenhagen to the extent that it had. But one thing you said that I really think is so important, and it's the same narrative I have, which is we have in place laws and, in fact, a whole paradigm that may have worked in the 90s, but we're in an entirely new landscape now, and those things aren't working now, and they're being taken advantage of. And I really like what you said about that, because I think we are in a new era, and I think you've recognized that through your law, which is very cool and really important.
Well, I agree with that. Especially in the Nordic countries, we had some 3 or 4 different periods of housing regulation, where the period between start 90s and until a few years ago, there was a strong confidence in market solutions, and also in leaving some of the need for leaving all of the need for affordable housing to the social housing associations and non-profit associations, and then letting the market take the rest of it. And I think that made a very difficult situation in the Nordic capitals, and also in Copenhagen, where you have some 20% that is non-profit housing associations, and then you would have 80% market housing, and that's what we challenged with our legislation, saying that the old housing, private housing estates, those should be regulated, and we should keep a strong and tight regulation so that it's possible for people who have normal jobs to drive the buses in Copenhagen, or who's working in the kindergartens or in the shops at the counters. They should also be able to live close to their job. They shouldn't, on top of a low wage, also have a 1.5 hour commute to get to the place they work. And that's very important for us to reinstate that principle in the way that we plan our cities.
I think what you just said It's a very simple sentence. You said that it's important that also nurses and bus drivers and people who work in shops have the right to live in the city. It's a very simple sentence, but it's actually very radical. It shouldn't be radical because it's like this is how we remember that cities were. But I mean, when we've been around the world, we see nurses, teachers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, they are all commuting into the cities to work. They can't afford to live there. And I remember when we were in Copenhagen for the premiere, we made a lot of interviews, we met a lot of people. All the young journalists told us the same stories. I cannot afford to live in town. I have to live out there. I live with a friend. I mean, also young professionals were under the same stress. So, I mean, I've checked you. You were 34 when you were in the panel. You're 36 now. So you're also kind of closer to that generation who is not so safe, because the older generation must sit a little bit safer. So do you think that also you have closer to, when your passion in this is also connected to that yourself is also in this kind of stage of life where you need to get into the housing market, and suddenly it's not that easy anymore?
Well, I think that for my generation of people who are born in the 80s, there's another view on how housing market and urban development goes and how it works. When we go back a few decades, then there was a very strong emphasis on development and how to turn around cities who were maybe, especially the inner parts of the cities were challenged by urban decay, or how you say, and I think that for my generation, we'd more had a much more skeptical view on the whole bank loan and expensive housing and the financial crisis and how it worked together with and crashed in 2008, and especially in Denmark, but also many other European countries. We've seen severe consequences from that, and people losing their houses, losing their jobs, and banks going bankrupt because they made all these crazy investments. And I think it's been part of the upbringing that we had, and the way we view urban development is also influenced by those experiences in the financial crisis. And I think that's why people have a much more strong support for demanding a non-profit housing in urban development, and for keeping old cheap private apartments regulated, and for keeping prices down on co-op housing, which is also a very large part of Copenhagen housing, as in Sweden also. And we're fighting a very strong or fierce battle to keep those housing prices somewhat low. It's still very expensive, but to keep a large part of the middle class into the group that can actually buy their own house in one way or the other, and to ensure that those who can't, they have the possibility to move into non-profit apartments.
This makes me want to go back to our days 2 years ago in Copenhagen. Leilani, the Canadian embassy invited us for lunch, and they also had invited some key players of the Danish business life, and they were all in the real estate business. And there was only one empty chair, that somebody who had promised to be there, and you can guess, Kaare, who it was. It was Blackstone, didn't show up.
Nils Jansson.
Yeah,
Yes.
So he didn't show up when he understood what the film was about, and when Leilani had started to speak. But remember, Leilani, you were sitting with somebody, I should maybe mention the name, but it was from some very heavyweight player in your country, saying that it's not a human right to live in the middle of Copenhagen. And Leilani, I remember, so you lost a little bit of your beautiful face for a while.
Yes, that was a very tense conversation because, I mean, as you said, Frederick, it is a radical, for some reason it's become a radical idea that people who make our cities work should actually live in those cities. I mean, how that's become radical, I don't know. But this gentleman was saying to me, you know, human rights don't say that you have the right to live in city center. And so we got into a big debate about that and about the merits of having teachers, firefighters, police officers, nurses living in the city. And while there may not be the right to the city, and there may not be a human right to live in city center, there is a human right to remain in a unit that you're living in and to not be costed out of your unit and basically forced out by escalating prices. That is a human right because affordability is a key component of the right to housing. And so enacting legislation to protect that, the ability of people to stay in their homes, is super important and is consistent with the right to housing. That's what I argued.
Kaare, just a quick one. When you entered into the government 2 years ago, the letters from Leilani about Blackstone landed on your table to answer. And you were one of the ones who actually did the work. The Swedish government hardly answered at all. So, I mean, and other governments, the American government certainly didn't answer. So what did you think when you saw those letters?
Well, I think that it is a very important focus to have in all of cities around the world where people are getting pushed out, and we ran to that election on some of the issues that you brought up in your film, and that was debated around also in Copenhagen, both because of your film, but also because of the new players on the Copenhagen housing market, especially Blackstone, and so that was in line with what I thought, and I think also I answered it. I don't remember exactly what I wrote in that answer, but I think we did, and we were working at that time in making a proposal for legislation that was strong enough to push out or to make some of the most aggressive investors stay away from Denmark, and also to send a warning to some of, we still have many Danish, especially pension funds, and also many Scandinavian investors, big Swedish and Norwegian housing asset managers who are in Copenhagen, but also to send a warning to them that if you misuse some of this legislation, which is it's not detailed into every small sentence, so you can always find some ways to, if you care so little about people who live in the apartments, you can find a way to make fast money on it. So that was the double side of that legislation, and that was what we were preparing at the time when I answered the letter from you.
And then you started up a parliamentary committee straight off. That was almost your first move.
Yeah, we did that before the election. We forced, because of the debate, we managed to get the former government to put down that committee also, because they wanted to not have that debate, but there were three experts who were making a strong case or analysis on the situation with this specific paragraph, and what they concluded was that usually they double the rent in our capital area. When people move out, some new tenant move in, then the rent is typically doubled. And of course, we could see when we have some 75,000 of these regulated cheap apartments left that is not yet been renovated, then it would be a matter of 7 or 8 years before they would all be at a whole different level of rent, and we needed to move relatively fast to get that, to change that development. And we saw also, we had some other people looking at the prices of the property in Denmark and in Copenhagen especially, and we saw that in 5 years they doubled the value. The prices they're trading them for were doubled in 5 years. So we could see that it was something going on that wasn't sustainable in the long run, and not for the people who buy them, but especially not for the people who live in them, because they would be pushed out. Because what especially Blackstone did was that when they buy them, they put in in the way they calculate the price, they put in an expectation of how many people they can get out of the apartment in the first 2 years, 5 years, whatever. And then because they expect to get people to move much quicker than other buyers, then they can calculate a higher price, and then they win, of course, and they buy the properties in the end. And that's what we wanted to stop. And I think we did manage to get an agreement that has stopped many of those more short-term speculators.
First of all, I think that parliamentary committee is really interesting and, again, offers a model for other countries, in my opinion, to start there. Review it yourself. I mean, I keep, agitating with different governments and saying, look what's happening within your borders. But it's really for parliamentarians to investigate this themselves and understand the issue. I think that's very important. But I'm wondering, Kaare, if you could take us through the legislation a little bit. Like, what does your legislation actually do? How did you manage this scenario through legislation? And what does it look like?
Well, there's three main parts of it. There's one part that's strengthening tenants' rights. One part making the renovations more climate friendly, but also thereby more difficult to make. And then there's one part making it impossible to make renovations and double the rent within the first 5 years that you own the property. So if we start with that last one, then that's been the most debated one, and the right-wing parties, or most of them, were fiercely against making this a 5-year. Originally, I wanted a 10-year ban on this renovation and housing. But what the compromise was, a 5-year period, and I think also that's going to work. What we've seen since we put that in is that the property prices has fallen about 8 to 12%, and that many of the well-known aggressive investors don't invest in Copenhagen anymore. But still, we have pension funds, and we have Swedish investors, especially who still invest in Copenhagen. But there's been a push towards constructing new properties and less buying old properties, and that's just actually what we want as a government, because constructing new property does add new apartments. Even if they're expensive, it does add a new apartment, so that the demand is better met. So that's one part. That's a 5-year ban on making this rent increase. And then we strengthened tenants' rights by a series of new measures. One is that you can't offer people money to move out of the apartment. We saw a lot of tenants, and I heard a lot of people writing to me about how they tried to buy everyone out of the apartment, and people felt compelled to take the money and get out of the apartment. But in Copenhagen, even if you get 30,000 euros for moving out of your apartment, you can't buy anything with that money. So it does leave people without a home. And we tripled the fines that you get when you don't comply with housing board's recommendations, and we made a lot of other smaller changes that is very down in the paragraphs, but does make difference. For example, every tenant in an apartment gets to know what the other tenants pay in rent. So you have a transparency, which of course worked. The non-transparency situation worked for the landlords especially. And then we made new demands on the climate standard, the energy standard of the building. So when they renovate, they have to use more of the money, most of the money on getting climate-friendly buildings, and of course that's also working for the tenants, because it's pushing down the cost for heating the houses. So that's the three main parts, and especially the 5-year ban on housing increase after you buy an apartment. That's been very debated.
And obviously very successful, because if these companies say it's not so nice to invest in Denmark anymore, it's like you are actually freezing in this very destructive energy that is entering into many markets. And I know, I mean, Sweden, your neighbor country, we have this strong social democratic traditions, really taking care of people. You know, we have the feeling that we are defended and protected. But suddenly we could see that our old systems has eroded. And as you mentioned, that these new entities coming into our homes, they were not on the housing market before. They're all financial driven groups, and they're looking for loopholes. And in Denmark, they found one loophole, how to put up the rent, and in Sweden, they found a different one, and so it goes from country to country. But overall, their idea is to push up the value of the stock of the companies so they can sell them, because it's. I mean, we have been looking into Blackstone for a long time, and at their homepage it said, "Buy, fix, sell." That's the business model of Blackstone: buy, fix, sell. And when that buy, fix, sell comes in, and in a very short time pushes up the rents, and then they just move out. Of course it's not good for any society. So it's really cool that you're taking them on.
Absolutely. And how much pressure were you under to not try to pass that legislation? I'm interested to know that for sure. How hard was it?
Well, there was a lot of pressure, of course. Parliamentary pressure from the right-wing parties, or most of them. We did get one of the parties into the agreement. That's what made it viable on the long run, because then they can't turn it around if they get a majority. But also from the Pension Funds Association, which is a bit of a more special situation for me, because Social Democratic Party in Denmark have always been strong tied to labor unions, and labor unions are in control of pension funds. So that was a bit more delicate, but they were quite fair in their critique, or keeping on more sort of. They weren't pushing out fake news and making these kind of propaganda moves. But then there was the financial sector and the landlords associations, and those two were the most aggressive, and they were trying to push the discussion into another form of housing, which is called co-op housing, which is sort of a halfway between a rental and an owner apartment. We have a lot of them, especially in Copenhagen, and because all these systems are linked together, they tried to make this scare campaign that we were pushing down people's values, and that was large part of the debate. And now we've seen, it's been a year, and of course they weren't pushed down. They exactly the same price, or even higher than they were at the time. But especially the financial sector were working also with the lobbyists and the people that they engaged to push on the political parties to get this legislation stopped or postponed at least. And of course also after we passed it, it's not popular everywhere to stop the housing prices increase, and to especially on property, when we've seen this 8 to 12% decrease in prices, then of course some of the people who represent those values, they're complaining about it, but I used to say that they had a double in their price in 5 years. So I think that it's only if they bought just 1 year ago, then they lost something. If they had the property longer, then they still have a very strong business case in those properties.
The billionaires of America became 25% richer 2020, and I guess also the billionaires of Denmark made the same. So, I mean, we shouldn't pity the rich right now.
No. But one question that journalists always ask me when I'm saying that I agree with rent caps, or that I agree that rents shouldn't be raised, over periods of time, rent freezes, that sort of thing. They always say to me, well, won't that mean that landlords will let their buildings fall into disrepair because they can't recoup the cost of the repairs or renovations or upgrades. What and in light of your legislation, which also says that buildings should be moving toward green renovations, what's your response to that?
Well, we also heard that a lot, but I think that people, it didn't resonate that much in population in the media, because I think that the people don't see it you never visit someone in Copenhagen who has these worn down apartments. There's very few of them left, and maybe, of course, there is a risk that some of the apartments are renovated less than they used to be, but I'd also say that some of them were renovated too much and with a too high frequency. I think that, of course, as a landlord, you should be able to keep them in a good standard, the apartments, and you should also be able to get those money back from the people who lived in them. But that was just not the case, and I think I think they got the money back in 2.5 or 3 years, but the rent was still very high. So for after 3 years, you paid the investment, and then you can move on. And there's no investments in the world at this time that pays off so well. So I think I think that they're going to be they're going to be at a good level, and I don't think that this legislation is going to change that situation very much. But then again, if you have some apartments that has a different level of maintenance than others, but it's still, say, you're able to live there, and you have a high energy standard, and you have the all the things you need in to live there. Then I think that's maybe also part of a diverse housing market, that you don't need perfectly maintained and renovated apartments for all people. If you're a student, then you can live some years in something that is maybe a bit less maintenance.
Yeah, good answer. Now I'm going to just quote you from now on when I'm asked by journalists.
Yeah, that's fine. I did live as a student in one of those apartments.
Me too. Several.
We had a few weeks ago, Leilani and I was part of a panel at the progressive group of the European Parliament, and Mr. Franz Timmermans, the executive vice president of the EU Commission. He first of all recommended everybody to see Push, which we liked, but he also said that, which I think was interesting, that he's an older social democrat, and he said we made some mistakes, we the social democrats also. We believed a little bit too much that the market would be the solution for everything, and now we have to solve this. Do you feel also that the same kind of that you have to repair the mistakes of former generations, kind of?
Yes, I think that's true, because in the 90s we had there was, ideologically speaking, it was a very mixed time, and people were trying to find social democrats at measuring by how many European governments were social democrats. I think it was 12 out of 15 or something like that in the mid-90s. So that was very successive, but measuring at what changed in policy, I think we did make some mistakes in believing in knowledge economy and this vision about Europe being some place that would think a lot and design a lot, and then we would have produced everything in China, and if our toilet broke down, we would have some guy from Romania coming to fix it, and I think that whole knowledge economy, that vision of society was wrong, because it emphasized people with long education and high salaries, and it sort of lost track of all the other people who needs to be there to make society viable and sustainable, and people driving the buses, and the people in our hospitals, and all the other, not only the doctors, but also those 90% of hospital staff that are not doctors, and I think we lost track that vision of a society that has a place for everyone. And even if you don't take you don't go to college or take any other long education, then you still have a high wage and possibilities in your life. And I think maybe that was pushed out in favor of some more focus on possibilities instead of equality. And I think that's the case with the Social Democrats. But I also think that what we learned also for some part because of the corona pandemic and all these things going on is that you can actually put a lot more of how society develops and the policy that you make into the hands of politicians and make political decisions, not push it to the EU or push it to the market or push the decisions everywhere else around. And I think that the notion that politicians make political decisions and we are responsible for those, I think it's been giving a lot more room in the past 2 or 3 years, at least with the people I discuss from the Social Democrats around Europe.
I find it amazing. I get a lot of pressure, a lot of comments that I'm trying to move the world back to socialism, and that people are so afraid of the idea of caring society, of caring governments, of re-engaging the social contract. I actually find it remarkable, but there is this new wave, and we're seeing it also with sort of feminist governance that's emerging, especially in the Nordic countries, but also elsewhere, where it's the sense of actually we can be caring, and we can have governments that support the people, and I'm so happy for that kind of movement. It lets me breathe more easily when I see that politicians actually also agree that we need to strengthen the social contract.
So just one final question to you, Kaare, Minister of Housing in Denmark, Kaare Dybvad. So what is your advice to your colleagues in the rest of Europe? I mean, to the colleagues here in Sweden, because you in Berlin are ahead.
Well, I think that Leilani's point about making a thorough work before you go into the legislation phase is very important. So we need parliamentary commissions or expert commissions or whatever tradition you have in each country is different probably from country to country. But I think that helped us a lot that we had this 200 pages report to stand on when we came with our proposals back some years ago. And I think that people should be aware that there are very strong interests at stake, especially for, as I mentioned, the financial sector was very skeptical of our proposal, and you're getting in a fight with some of the big players in traditional politics. But I think that when we discussed it also in the government, I think we always had the view in it that we were proposing legislation that most Danes agreed in, and we think one thing is that we thought it was the right thing to do, and that's why we started it. But also that most people agreed with us. Also, people who vote for center-right parties, they also thought that Blackstone and the representatives they had in Denmark were going too far. So I think that was one thing that I always kept in mind. We were about to lose this whole case because some of the other parties in Parliament were changing. Also, some of them, one of the parties who brought us into power and who's supporting us as a government, usually they were skeptical about this legislation. But I think that's very important to remember that most people see the reason behind having cities where all sorts of people can live, no matter how much you earn, and most people see reason in not making fast profits on buying and selling property because. Well, I think at least in the Nordic countries, but also maybe in most of Europe, we have this one notion from the social democratic and workers movement that you should always push society towards earning more on your work and earning less on owning money. So if we could do that slowly but gradually, I think that would be a strong positive force. And I think that restricting fast money on property is one tool to get there. But the overall development of making people earn more on their job and less on their property and their assets, I think that's very important to always keep in mind when you make political decisions.
Cool. That's a very good message to your colleagues out around Europe, and of course out also in Canada or other countries that needs inspiration. And I tell you also, Minister, that we've been contacted by a Danish entrepreneur in the housing sector, Rasmus Nørgaard, and he bought for Christmas. He bought like 200 licenses of the film to send to all his co-workers because he wanted them to see the film. And he's probably not one of your voters anyway. So I mean, also, I don't know, but I mean, also in that sector there are people who can also oppose this kind of hit and run tactics that Blackstone are more typical of.
At least the people who built the houses are voting for Social Democrats, but I don't think that people who own the houses are voting for us. Not all of them, at least.
No, that's okay. There are not so many. So, Leilani, this was Pushback Talks. And so what we need to say now? We don't have any money. Support us on patreon.com.
The way we always end.
Talks.
Every episode ends the same way. Please support our podcast. We do this with no resources.
And today, again, thank you to CPH Docs, the best documentary film festival in the world, seated in Copenhagen, where we had a world premiere of Push. And with the love and the passion of that festival, we reached out to tenants in Blackstone homes and to journalists and to politicians that actually in the end landed in this podcast episode today. Isn't that cool, Leilani?
It's very cool. Copenhagen has a special place in my heart now. From my experiences, just amazing.
Thank you, Kaare Dybvad, for taking part in Pushback Talks. And let's hope we can meet in Copenhagen one day and update this because history is not over. It will continue.
Oh, you're very welcome here. And thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Leilani. Now it's time for you to, I guess, walk the dog or something.
Or something.
Okay. Take care. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To watch Push, visit pushthefilm.com. You can also support us by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.